Hello, my name is Bret, and I'm live. I'm glad you're here. This is my weekly live stream, and this week, no guests. This is all Q&A. In fact, we've had so much success with Q&As in the past that we're going to be changing the format, and I'm going to be doing this more often. So instead of once a month, we're going to be doing it every other week, and then changing the focus, sort of toggling the focus of each episode. But, you know, I answer whatever questions you have, so it doesn't really matter the topic. I'm just here for you, and we're going to hang out. So, hello, everyone. Miss some of the people in chat. Hello, everyone. All right, let's do it. Guess what? Next week is the 200th episode of this live stream. So, so I'm going to do this for the 200th time next week. And I don't know who I'm going to have yet. All the guests I've been inviting are all now scheduled for the future, but can't make it next week. It turns out that's actually a very busy week for everyone. So for some reason, my headphones aren't working. So we're going to have someone, a special guest, maybe no one. I'd like to have someone on. So you just have to come out and see. So next week's going to be just basically a celebration of 200 streams with a lot of fails, mic problems, music issues, green screen background problems. Like, we've had it all. But it's been actually a pretty good year. This last year has been very steady. So I've got a lot of plans this year. We're talking, and yesterday, by the way, plug to the High Fivers group. If you didn't know, I got membership plans. You can get membership here on YouTube. You can go to my website for memberships. You can go to Patreon for memberships. But in our Discord server, we have a monthly hangout where we do a High Fivers. That's the membership plan. It's like $5 or $6 a month, and it gets you access to a bunch of things, a couple of things, Discord exclusive channels, but as well as a monthly hangout where it's like a meetup. It's like an online virtual meetup, and it's just DevOps professionals talking about what they're working on with each other. It's very friendly. Newcomers welcome, even students. You're welcome to come to that. And we just talk about the things we're working on, and it's always a great time. I always learn something. So that happened yesterday. We do it once a month. And one of the topics was about who was going to be on the show this year. So having gone to KubeCon, finally back in the real world in Detroit in October, I went to a lot of booths and got a whole bunch of companies basically and projects in the CNCF ecosystem to be on the show. So that is starting, I guess, next month, technically. Well, actually, no, that's not true. January 26th. That's next week. So it's not next week. We've moved that date. It's now a different date. But we're going to have Project Calico, one of the CNIs, the networking for Kubernetes. That is going to be one of the upcoming shows. We've got plans for a lot of the other CNCF projects. I'm not going to name them because they're not booked yet, but we're all in the works. I got a whole team helping me out, and that's going to happen. So come back on Thursdays. We're always live. We record this, and then we edit it into a podcast. And let me know, by the way, in the chat or with a thumbs up or something right now, if you would like to see that podcast in video form. So this is what I consider the unedited version. But when we edit the podcast down, we clip it, right? We take out all of my ums and uhs. We take out some of the non-essential discussion maybe. We take out any gaps or any problems we might have. And then, of course, because it's audio only, we take out the demos because sometimes they just don't make sense when you're listening to it. But tell me if you're interested in a YouTube version of that podcast with video, because I know that other people do that. It would take extra effort for us, but I don't really know how many people would watch it. I mean, we've already got this live stream, so people watch this one. But would they really prefer one that's maybe 20 minutes shorter, that has maybe the beginning and the end, the waiting and all that stuff all edited out? Or does that really matter to you? Are you just going to skip ahead in this live show if you're watching it later? If you're actually watching this later now, throw in the comments if it's not live. Tell me how you listen to this, because if you would rather have it on YouTube in a semi-edited format, we'll consider that for future episodes this year. I know some people do that. We just leave this live stream up so that you can watch it later. But some people maybe don't want to click around and they'd rather have a more condensed version. Totally something we could do. Anyway, I'm wearing my KubeCon shirt. This is actually a new shirt I got from KubeCon this year. Pretty excited. Actually, it was a gift from some friends of mine. Let me actually do a plug for that on YouTube. Let me pull up his channel. Let me find him real quick. So while I'm doing all this introduction stuff, get your questions in. So I've got some announcements. I want to talk about some things that I'm doing, and then we're going to get to questions. So like Madrox, I see that talk about future of Docker. Now the containerd is growing. So we can talk about that. I can give you sort of my insider scoop. I have the Docker Captains program. I have meetings with Docker regularly. So yeah, let's talk about that. All right. Oh, I'm not logged in. All right, hold on a second. I got to log back into Firefox. I don't know why it's so hard to find this video. All right, James Spurin. I don't know why it took me a second to pull that up. My YouTube searching was failing me. So, don't think he's on the show today in the chat. But James has a great channel. I'm going to put this in chat. Dive into. He's got a great channel, a fellow Docker captain, and he's kind of killing it. He's got like a full Docker course. I can't remember how long it is. He's got a really popular one, Kubernetes 1-hour course. He's got that nice English accent, if you like accents. So go check him out. And he, I believe, actually, he and a few other friends bought this shirt for me, and I was so grateful for them. It was very cool. So, yay to them. All right, announcements, real quick. The website is relaunched, so there is going to be more content, but we're now reorganizing it and putting things in more logical places. It's not just a blog anymore. It's got more going on. So we've moved the newsletter. If you're on my newsletter on review, if you signed up on Twitter for my newsletter, if you're one of those 4,600 people, you have now been moved over, and that newsletter is going out later today. We almost had it finished before the show, but nope, it's coming out later today. So we're starting up a new weekly newsletter. I've had newsletters I think I've had like 5 different newsletters over the last 20 years, but the last newsletter was on review, and they shut that down as of yesterday, and so we had to move it, and now we're running it on my own site on Ghost. Thanks for the team for helping me, and there's a lot going on here. So we're basically going to centralize all the content that I'm creating and start to add more and more things here. So right now, you'll see that there's the newsletter. You can sign up for that for free. And we now have memberships here. So just like the YouTube memberships here, thank you to those that are members. I appreciate you. We just started YouTube memberships a couple months ago. And we also have Patreon members. But I'm slowly going to be moving Patreon. If you're on Patreon now, thank you so much. I appreciate you. And you can stay there for now. What we're going to do is we're going to be slowly moving Patreon over to my server so that we can do more things. But a bunch of us dev people, we don't really hang out on Patreon. At least that's what I've gotten after 3 years of using it. Very few people respond to my posts there. There's not really a lot of activity. All of our community is over here in Discord. So come and check us out on Discord if you're not aware. We have a 12,000 user DevOps server. It's devops.fan right there. Come join us and talk and ask all your questions all day, every day. I'm in there at least reading, if not responding to people every day, it seems like, on my mobile now. It's the place I hang out, basically there in Twitter, but more and more here because this is where the community is growing and these are where my friends are at. So we have all sorts of new channels. We just added a Swarm channel, bringing back Swarm finally for some of the upcoming releases of Docker, which we'll talk about. And so we finally added a Swarm channel. Before, it was just in the Docker channel. You just talked about Swarm in there. But some of the community who's still rocking the Swarm fans, production Swarm people, wanted a dedicated area. So let's do it. And we put it in there. And now it's one of the most popular channels on the server. So we're working on more things. We're actually going to be launching a Swarm awesome list to help you find and curated good stuff for Swarm, maybe like your ingresses or any storage drivers or things you might need. There's not really a list out there for Swarm. So we're going to be working on that. It's already started. It's just not launched. Sorry for the jets in the background. They decided to start flying as soon as I went live. And of course, we have all the course help that you can get in here. So if you're in any of my courses, thank you again for being in my courses. And the course help is down here as well. You can always ask Q&A in the courses, but if you like Discord and live chat better, then we have that course help is there. And there's all this other stuff going on there. We have a bunch of memes and retro tech, which is honestly my favorite, some of my favorite channels. Just because I don't have to go to Reddit anymore. People are posting them all from Reddit so that I can just read them all in here. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. Some good stuff in there. Some people talking about ChatGPT lately. Of course, everyone's talking about ChatGPT. It was a topic on yesterday's High Fiver group. But back to the website, if you're interested in memberships and you don't want to do it on here on YouTube, YouTube's fine. But if you don't want to do it here on YouTube and you want to do it on my site, I get a tiny bit more money, maybe like 50 cents more if you don't do it on YouTube or something. But now the same opportunities that you have for membership here are also on my site. You can sign up for those with a credit card. I think there's other maybe payment options. I haven't tested every payment option there. But however you want to join me. The membership gets you access to exclusive supporter channels. You're basically supporting all this content I'm making. It's not helping me make the Udemy courses. If you're in the Udemy courses, you've already paid for those. So that's my appreciation there. I'm just updating the courses. In fact, we just announced we're getting ready to send out the email in a couple of days, a whole couple new sections in Docker Mastery around GitHub Actions and CI automation. So stay tuned for those if you're in the Docker Mastery course. So those are there, but the rest of my content, all of my open source on GitHub, all the examples there, all these YouTube videos every week, the podcast, managing the Discord server, keeping track of that community and helping them out, as well as all the blog posts I have here, which articles are, we're going to have a dedicated area for blog articles. You can see some of them here. We just posted the latest videos, which are also in the Docker Mastery course, but the latest videos on installing Docker for all different scenarios, Docker Desktop for Linux, Docker Engine for Linux Server, Mac, Windows, you name it. There's videos on there for every one of them. Of course, they're in this channel, but if you want to check them out over there. And, there's lots of other old articles that I wrote last year, including stuff like my really popular DevOps Engineer long article on describing what I consider a DevOps engineer. All this is available over there, and it's all free. So what you're really paying for with the membership, besides just supporting all my open source work and all this open content, is you're getting access to, in the Gratitude Givers, you're getting access to the exclusive channels for just Gratitude Givers. I kind of paid more special attention to those people in those channels in Discord. And then on the High Fivers, that's where you get to hang out with us monthly in the Meetup. And honestly, if it's, I don't know, I love that group. I think it's a great deal at $6 a month or $5 a month, depending on where you buy it. And I learned so much in there. Everybody, even someone commented this week, senior professionals that are in DevOps and have been there for decades or more, or at least more than a decade, one of them made a comment that's why they come to that thing to learn. And it's a discussion. It's people hanging out like a water cooler. It's not someone presenting. It's not a webinar. It's not a YouTube video. It's us just coming in and having honest discussions. And the discussions they go all over the place, right? It's just like a group of friends hanging out at coffee or at happy hour. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm looking forward to more of you showing up in that. We have over 100 people signed up for that, but we only get around 10 on a monthly schedule, and people rotate. So you're welcome to come, and if you don't like it, you can always cancel. So, check it out if you want to have a conversation and talk about stuff. Several of the people have been graduates of the courses and shown up to get more information from others sharing and ask questions of others and get group feedback, like asking for others to review their Docker file or their Kubernetes manifests or stuff like that. So you're welcome to bring that and ask others for help. We haven't really had anyone come in and say, I have a specific production problem. I need you to fix it right now. We're not exactly like the 24-hour support desk, but we'll try to help. We'll do what we can. So there's that. Also, thank you. Please bear with me because I might cough a little bit this week. I'm recovering from a cold that I had last week. So, but anyway, one last little thing before we get to some questions. In the newsletter this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about ways to access your Kubernetes server. So if you're not on the newsletter, jump on it, because one of the things I will share is that the tweet from Kelsey sharing about how he accesses stuff remotely when he's on his computer. More specifically, when you're developing and you need a bunch of other microservices running, and you maybe don't want to run those locally, you want to run them on a remote server, because why run it all locally, especially if you're on a underpowered laptop? Kubernetes is not kind to hardware. So he shared a project. I don't know how new it is. I didn't actually look at the init date on the first commit, but Kube Forward. It's a project that allows you a little bit easier than the kube control port forward you might be used to. It allows you to forward a whole bunch of ports from a particular namespace or sort of in bulk with a single command. So it's a little bit more intelligent than just a single command line because, kube control port forward is usually focused on one port. So, excuse me, sorry, this is going to keep happening. So anyway, there's that. And I'm going to talk about that in the newsletter, as well as other ways to access your Kubernetes cluster. And yeah, so let's talk about it. What questions do we have? Let me sip some tea so I can try to prevent from coughing in your ears. Jordan's voting for the video podcast would be great. Yeah, it would actually be interesting. So I'm a big fan of Twit. I've been a fan of Twit for 20 years. So do you know about Twit? Maybe not quite 20 years, but yeah, Twit TV. Jumping over here. One of the probably the original tech podcast network. Leo Laporte, founder. If you've been around long enough, you know Screensavers way back in the day. If you knew of Dig, that's also from some of the staff. Kevin Rose on that Screensavers show way back 20 years ago. It was a fantastic show. I wish they still had it. It's crazy that nowadays we just don't care to watch broadcast TV to learn about tech. We go to the internet. But that was a great show back then. Anyway, they've had Twit for a long time. Leo started it, and they have tons of podcasts there. So if you don't know about them, just go to twit.tv. One of my favorites is Security Now. Back when I was a Windows guy, I used to listen to Windows Weekly with Paul Thurrott every week. And I kind of hop in and out of different ones. It might be Floss, the open source show. I might jump into the Mac break because I'm on a Mac. This Week in Tech is sort of just general news. It's pretty good. And they're all geeks. They're all nerds. And they have a very loyal, large following. So if you didn't know about that, go check it out. Because it's one of those hidden gems, I think, of podcasting. Anyway, the point of me bringing that up was that they do audio and video podcasts. They send them out together, and that kind of would be double the work for us to do on the podcast networks. But putting it on YouTube shouldn't be a big stretch for us, just simply re-uploading it to YouTube. So we might try to do that. I appreciate it because I wanted to see if anybody would really watch those, as opposed to watching this live. Like, you're here live, so you would just watch this. All right, let's get back to Madrox's question. So the future of Docker, we're probably going to have an episode later this year on sort of the status of Docker when Docker releases their next big release. How do I know that Docker is releasing a next big release? Well, the version you're all running of Docker Engine, not Docker Desktop, but Docker Engine, is 2010. So it was released in 2020 because they were doing date-based release versions. So if I go over to GitHub and go to Moby, which is still sort of the core open source for Docker, and I go over to releases, look at that. So last week, they released the 23 release client version 2. So they're actually, one of the things they're doing here, and they highlight this here, is they're going back to numbered-based versions, which if you've been around Docker long enough, you know that they started that way went to date-based, and now they're going back to version-based or Simver, or maybe Simver-ish. Anyway, so there's going to be, they're not exactly listing all of the new features yet. I think they're just not trying to spoil it for everyone and keep a little bit under wraps. If you're someone who stares at the pull requests, you can gather what's really going on. But Docker Engine itself is a combination of multiple repos. So it is a little bit of tea leaf reading. There's a separate repo for the CLI. There's separate repos for some of the things like libnetwork and whatnot, separate parts of it. And of course, if you start talking about Docker Desktop has probably a dozen different repos at least that combine up into it. A lot of them are open source. There's VPN kit, data kit, build kit. What else? I feel like there's one I'm missing. Linux kit, and there's a bunch that come up into the closed source solution, which is Docker Desktop. So there's a this much of Docker Desktop that is closed source, and then of course they build it privately and package it privately. But that Containerd is really popular on Kubernetes, and if you didn't notice, Docker started the Containerd project 5 years ago, 6 years ago. They intentionally wanted to move to a more a reduced feature set for specific use cases like Kubernetes. So they took part of the Docker engine, made the Containerd project with it, and the rest is history. So we all now have Containerd as the preferred and default container runtime in Kubernetes. And underneath Docker, when you run Docker locally, you're also running Containerd. In fact, you've been running Containerd for 6 years. Docker, when you run Docker run, it spins up Containerd underneath it to spin up runc, which is then what starts the container. So technically there's 3 executables involved with every container start. So Containerd has been a thing for a long time. It sort of became the stable preferred version for Kubernetes. There's also CRI-O, but I think that's really, the only people I see using CRI-O are the ones that are deliberately deploying OpenShift and using Red Hat. Nothing wrong with CRI-O. It's just, there's not a lot of reasons to shift from the default. And the reality is most of us are all running distributions, and the distribution comes with their preferred runtime. So you're not really choosing this thing, unless you're maybe doing a kubeadmin install, which is not my recommendation for your first few years of Kubernetes. If you're doing real world business production Kubernetes, you probably should not be using vanilla upstream. You should probably be using a distro. I've said that 1,000 times. I'll keep saying it, but there's little things like there was a bug in a particular release of Containerd that matched a particular release of Ubuntu, which was the latest releases, that happened to cause a problem that one of our users in Discord discovered. That's not necessarily an issue when you're using distributions, because they do more thorough testing on distributions of Linux, and they make sure that this stuff works. And then if they have an issue, they usually have a support article and they usually release a fix. Whereas maybe the mainline Kubernetes project, maybe on some rare cases with bugs, might take a little bit longer to sort of deal with that, right? So you are dealing with, when you don't have the customer support, or you don't have a company depending on that customer support, that's just the nature of the difference between open source and paid offerings. So I would recommend things like Rancher or Tanzu or whatever your particular environment. If you're in the cloud, obviously you lose the cloud's versions. Every major cloud has all the great Kubernetes, and always use those. So I always recommend those over doing vanilla, just because it's a lot more work and you have to be a lot more of an expert in Kubernetes to maintain it, troubleshoot it, match the versions of everything, all that stuff. And that's what the distributions do for you. So Containerd is just Containerd. There are new features in Containerd. Most of them go unused because we all just do normal, regular Kubernetes. But Containerd, well, one of the things we talked about, in fact, on this channel, if you go back, one of the big announcements in the fall of last year in autumn was that WASM, WebAssembly, is now going to be a supported runtime in Containerd. So you'll be able to run WebAssembly binaries without having to do anything special to run them in Kubernetes. And that's already kind of working, but go back in this channel, look for my WASM video. I had Nigel Poulton on, and we both talked about it back and forth. We kind of I interviewed him essentially. And we talked about what WASM is. Why do you care about what cloud native container-based WebAssembly is, which is different than the browser-based WebAssembly? but that you can run these binaries, and they're really fast, they're really small, they don't need huge images, they're actually quite small, they're scratch, they're essentially empty other than your WASM binary. But WASM isn't necessarily ready for server mainstream yet. It's got a lot of limits when running it on a server. You can't do all the things that you would normally do with a server program because it hasn't fully fleshed out the WASI spec, or the WASI WebAssembly Systems Interface, I believe is what that stands for. And so WASI is the standard that's going to allow us to run containers with WebAssembly in them. Don't listen to the hype that Docker is dead, WebAssembly is here on servers, or that it's containerless WebAssembly. No, that's not true. What's going to end up happening in the industry, and others like Kelsey Hightower have also predicted this, is that we've already figured out that containers are a solid pipeline for shipping software to servers. We know how to build them. We know how to create Docker files or whatever other file you want to use to build it. We already know how to test them and run them with various runtimes. We know how to deploy them into clusters with Kubernetes or simple things like Google Cloud Run. So we already know how to do all of that. There's no reason to completely throw all that out, at least no reason I can think of, to throw all that out for just running a WebAssembly binary. It's just a different type of binary that needs a different runtime. To me, it's essentially as if you took your Node.js app and you packaged it up as a single file, and then you shipped that, and Docker happened to already have the Node binary built into it. That's essentially what WebAssembly is doing in Cloud Native, is we're going to be running a WASM Edge or a compatible binary that's inside of Containerd, and Containerd will have that plugin. Of course, your sysadmins will have to install that on each of the Kubernetes nodes, but maybe eventually it'll just come by default. And then when you have Linux containers, now you will have a WASM container. You also have Windows containers. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's just a different type of container. But it has the same ideas. It uses a registry. It's standardized in the OCI, hopefully someday. It is able to use push and pull. You're able to have the same ideas of images and running the images in a container. All the security boundaries of containers are there. It's just WASM has extra layers of security. So there's some people that are confusing a lot of this news and thinking that we're somehow going to be able to remove layers of this stuff. And no, that would be replicating all the work we all just did for the last 9 years into some new solution. Why would we do that? Let's just use the established standards that we have, which is registries, container runtimes, Linux kernels, all that good stuff. So if you haven't looked into that and you're interested in the future of tech, because it's not really ready for prime time today, I don't think. You have to be on the bleeding edge to really want to use it in the real world. But go check it out. The video is here, and it's also living on Docker's channel here on YouTube as well. So, all right, let me catch up on chat. So that's a little bit about the future Containerd and the future of Docker. Hopefully that helped your question. Will Cryo capture the Docker's market? Not at all. No, I don't think that Cryo... The problem is these are very low-level tools. So not a lot of people are very heavily opinionated about which runtime they need to run on a server. So you're just really going to be using the runtime that comes with your distribution. If you're using Rancher, they've picked one for you. If you're using, name another tool, they've picked one for you. All the clouds picked their own runtime. Very few of them pick Cryo, just because Containerd was first, and it's a little bit broader support. It's got a little bit more functionality and feature set. Cryo has a few features that it doesn't. None of these things you would care about. If you don't know about the features, you don't care about them. They're basically what I would consider esoteric or edge case features. Someone on here who's probably much more knowledgeable about Cryo will probably advocate for it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a matter of which one do you want to use. A majority of the market, a vast, vast majority of the market is moving from Docker to Containerd, because essentially we were using Containerd all along. So it's not a huge lift. But to go to Cryo, it's a completely different package. It's a completely different runtime. Originally, it actually did use a lot of the same libraries as Containerd. It kind of just wrapped Containerd a little bit, some of the Go libraries. But I'm not sure if that's still the case. It's up to you. If you want to build your own custom clusters and you want to do Cryo for some reason, great. But I still see a lot of the activity happening in Containerd. And to me, Cryo is just Red Hat's version of a runtime for Red Hat systems, because Red Hat does what Red Hat does. And if there's a tool out there, they'll make their own version of that because they can support it and they want to manage it long-term with their enterprise customers and stuff. So I don't see that. Just the same way as I don't see OpenShift being the major distribution of Kubernetes. OpenShift is really for people that are Red Hat shops. So if you're not a Red Hat shop, I know there are people that do this, but I haven't met or worked with any clients that chose OpenShift on if they are not a Red Hat shop, I guess is what I'm saying. So because there's so many distributions. There's nearly 100 distributions of Kubernetes. So there's a lot of competition there. Hello from a container. So are you watching from inside of a shell in your container? That's funny, Allah. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Is a new GitHub Actions section already available on Udemy? Yes, Jonathan. They are available. It's sections 19 and 20, I believe. And you will see those in an email coming from the Udemy educational announcements of my course that was planned to go out this week. Hopefully it'll land tomorrow. But those sections are already there. There's about 45 minutes of video. I think it's like 17 or 19 videos. Yes, and I agree. Security Now is cool. It's a great podcast. Steve Gibson, if you've been around the internet since the 90s, if you remember Shields Up, which was a tool we all had to use to make sure there was a firewall on our router to protect our Windows machine, because believe it or not, back in the 90s when we were plugging in Windows 95, sometimes you'd be plugging it into the internet and you didn't have a firewall on Windows 95. It did not exist. It didn't even exist in XP when it first came out on Windows XP. It was Service Pack 2, if some of you remember that established a new firewall, which was the first time we had a built-in firewall on Windows. So back in the 90s, we didn't have firewalls. So you would get random connections from the internet trying to basically hack you. And Steve Gibson made a great tool that would basically come back and test all your ports on the machine that you were coming from. This is before we used NAT by default. And this is before we even had Wi-Fi. So, we all have Wi-Fi routers and firewalls at our homes now. It's normal. That's really the only way we use the internet. And all of our devices now have built-in firewalls, and we use them when we're on the internet, usually anyway, right? Your phones and stuff. So, anyway, Security Now. I love it. So, thank you, JB. I'm just going to say JB there. Again, sorry for the coughing. I wish I was fast enough to hit the mute button. To thank you for the proper explanation of all the concepts. It's my third time trying to learn Kubernetes, and only now I truly understand it. Okay, well, that's really, really, I take that to heart. Kubernetes heart. The Kubernetes heart. I take that to heart, man, because I appreciate that. I try really hard to get the concepts, and I do talk a lot, right? So I think my next thing in the course is to put more visualizations in. I'm not great at visualization, so I want to improve my game there by adding things besides my big head to look at. Is open source always free? Does it have to be free? Cannot they just open source Docker Desktop and restrict commercial use for money only as they already do it now? I mean, they could, but what benefit? I think Docker has product team. I mean, the majority of stuff that's in Docker Desktop is already open source. The Docker engine's open source, the Docker command line's open source, Compose is open source, Build Kit is open source, Data Kit is open source, VPN Kit is open source. The only thing that's really not open source is the GUI, and then the bundler and the installer. There might be a few tiny little bits in there that are also not free. Maybe the bind mounting ability and stuff that Docker does, but I think that's a part of Data Kit, which is free. So I would argue that there would be no benefit and only just a bunch of work for them. They do have repos for you to submit. If you have issues, you go into Docker's GitHub and you look for, if you're on the Docker Desktop for Linux, you look for For Linux. It's called the For Linux repo. If you're on Docker Desktop for Mac, you look the For Mac repo. FOR-MAC, I think is what it is. And you can submit issues there that you're having in the tool. But even if they open source their installer and stuff, I'm not sure how much value that would add for any of us. And this goes back, right? This goes back 5 or 6 years ago to where they weren't really sure how they were going to package it all up, what they were going to license for free and what they weren't, paid upgrade features, stuff like that. So they probably played it safe, and they've just stayed that way ever since, with some of the paid closed source. But it's a good question. Because we did not jump into YAML black box magic straight away and now actually understood what the YAML is. Yeah. Someone actually asked me recently to do a video on YAML in the course, but I kind of felt like, I think maybe I added some resources to it to help, but I thought there's so many YAML videos on YouTube. Like I just didn't want to make a YAML video. So I don't know. Tell me if you think I need to make a YAML video for the course. Yeah, awesome. I'm glad to hear your progress there, JB, on all the things you're doing. Traffic's great. I'm actually working a little on the background. I'm talking with Traffic about potentially making a traffic course, so we'll see. Might be doing that this year. By the way, you'll see the little stuff around this video, all around this screen for merch. I have a merch store. You can get your DevOps mugs. You know, Valentine's Day is coming up. Maybe your spouse is a DevOps fan too, or maybe you can tell them that you like a DevOps shirt. I have a DevOps shirt that has this little logo, or any of my other shirts or mugs or sweatshirts or all, water bottles. I have a bunch of stuff there. So check out the merch below if you're interested. There are sometimes sales. I don't believe we're currently in a sale that is on the loot box. And I have a couple of friends that are designers, so they help me with the designs. And we got Foxy in there. If you recognize Foxy from a couple of the courses, the Kubernetes Mastery and the Node.js courses. If you remember SneakerNet from the 90s, that's back when we actually had to move data around on our feet, like with USB sticks, CD-ROMs, and floppy disks. That was called SneakerNet. I don't know if you know that or not, but I have a t-shirt on it now. So we made up some cool stuff. And I would love it if you'd buy some, because I'm always flattered. I went to KubeCon and several people had my shirts and I was so excited. I had to take selfies with all of them. We all did group selfies. It was a lot of fun. And those are people that are mostly from the Discord server. So that's another plug for that. I am working from an enterprise company. They don't use Docker Desktop. However, on my office laptop, I use Docker Desktop registered to my personal email ID and work on GitHub personal account. Is that fine? I'm not going to speak for product and licensing of Docker, but if you read the licenses, as long as you're not using Docker Desktop for company work of a large company, and as long as you're using it for open source needs or personal needs that aren't a part of a big company, you're totally fine. I know companies that, they buy the licenses. It's an honor system. So you buy the licenses and you're covered from a legal perspective at your company, but Docker isn't disabling features because they've determined that you're not using it correctly. So do what you think is right. If I use Docker for open source exclusively, and I am not a big company, but I still pay for it because that $3 or whatever it is, $3 or $4 a month for me. I'm a Docker captain. Like they probably could give it to me if I asked, but they don't. And I just want to support them because I believe in paying a few dollars for the things I believe in. So for example, like my iTerm terminal, I donate a couple dollars a month, I think $2 a month to that guy because I use that iTerm every day on my Mac for 10 years now or more. And I just feel like it's worth his time to keep that open source project. So I give him a couple of bucks. Not all of us have that money and time, and I understand. But I do believe in supporting the tools and the people that you can and help them. So I try to be members of other people's Patreons and YouTube channels and GitHub sponsorships. So I would, if it was me, I would look for a way to figure out how to pay for at least the cheapest version of Docker Desktop, because you're voting with your money, right? There is Rancher Desktop and Lima and all the other things, and we're actually working on a new episode coming up to talk about some of the new things for alternative clients other than Docker Desktop. But all of those exist if you're worried about it. If you're worried about licensing, try out Docker Desktop. Rancher Desktop, or the new Podman Desktop. I haven't used Podman Desktop extensively, but they are up and coming clients. I don't think any of them are near the feature set of Docker, but they do get sort of like the basics right. They do them well. So, yep, Nerd Control. Dan's talking about Nerd Control, Docker compatible CLI for sure. So you got Nerd Control. There's a whole list, and if you haven't seen that list, let me just pull that up real quick. So I'll share this in chat. So I put that link in chat. It's a list of Docker desktop alternatives, and evidently I'm missing one or two. So we're going to have a show in I don't know, maybe in a couple of months, maybe next month. We're going to talk about it. So go check that spreadsheet out. The idea is to put a whole lot of columns for all the features that these tools have, and then to compare and contrast which tools have which features. Maybe some have partial support for a feature, that kind of thing. That's something I maintain. And I try to get updates from the community because I can't be an expert in all of them. So if you know anything about the internals of that, you can add comments to that spreadsheet to help me out. I appreciate it. SneakerNet, the counterpart of snail mail net. The fastest way to send data is by snail. That's right. Yep. Somebody in here has been around a few years. Please explain CNI. It's basically first initially it was a Kubernetes standard. Now it's becoming a broader standard for more than just Kubernetes. But CNI is the standard for networking plugins for Kubernetes. If you've got more than one server in Kubernetes, they need to be able to talk to each other over various kinds of networks. And in order to do that, you maybe need special features. You might want encryption. You might want advanced networking layer topologies. You might want to do overlay networks, which is where you encapsulate the packets and allow them to go easier through firewalls and stuff. You might need VLANs, all sorts of things. Well, there's various CNI projects and tools that you plug into Kubernetes, and they give you basic functionality of allowing nodes to talk to each other because Kubernetes doesn't come with networking out of the box. So it'll work on one node, but the minute you want to have 2 or 3 nodes talking to each other and that one pod talking to the service of the other pod, you're going to need a CNI. And the CNI is so complex that they opted to just let the community, which already had a lot of other networking companies and expertise, create those. So you've got a bunch of tools now, all listed on the Kubernetes website. So just look up Kubernetes CNI and you'll get a nice list. And I have a couple of them on the show every year. It's not really like there's one major one that everyone uses. And if you determine that you're going to use a distribution of Kubernetes, it will come with its own CNI preference typically. So it will pick that for you. You don't necessarily have to know them all and decide which one you're going to use unless you're trying to build your own private cloud and you're going to go upstream vanilla and you've got a whole team of dedicated Kubernetes experts. That's when you need to go custom and evaluate the CNIs and do all that. Usually if you're doing something like AWS's EKS, you have 2 options there. You're going to have their option built in, VPCs, or one of the projects. I don't think it's Calico. I think it's Cilium. I'm not sure which one it is, but one of the C's, I think, is one of the options there. But that's it. You don't get to choose just any old option. So it really depends on where you're running your Kubernetes and what distribution you're running, and then that'll filter down the list, and then you choose from that list. And if you don't need the complexity, it's usually better to go with the simpler ones. You'll figure that out pretty quickly when you try to use them. Which ones are complicated, which ones aren't. Great question. All right. Do you have any thoughts on HashiCorp Nomad as an alternative to Kubernetes? I'm trying to decide if Nomad is worth learning. Yes, Nomad is a contender, but you've got multiple factors. This is never just about technical feature set. It's never about that. It's a multifaceted, complex story. You still got Swarm. You still got just Docker Engine. If you only need 3 servers and you don't need to do advanced rolling updates for 5.9 uptime kind of things, just use Docker Engine. Just install that on 3 servers, run your three containers on each server, and be done with it. I did that for years. A lot of us did that for years before we were rolling out Swarm or Kubernetes or something. If you're someone who's like we have a solid group of Swarm fans here, if you're someone who's got a very small amount of requirements, you're talking about a couple dozen containers. You're 5 servers or less, or basically less than 10 servers, and you don't have a lot of advanced requirements. You don't need service mesh or any high-end functionality. Something like traffic is okay as your your proxy and your ingress, which it's a great proxy and ingress, and you're happy with Swarm, just stick with Swarm. It's still in Docker. Mirantis is officially still supporting it. They've got a Swarm team, and it just doesn't get a lot of features. It's very slow to iterate. Nomad has a much bigger active project and community in terms of changes in open source, but it is also more work to install and maintain than Swarm. It's less work maybe than Kubernetes, but you have to run Nomad yourself, unless maybe HashiCorp provides their own cloud for Nomad, but I'm not sure if they do. I don't. Let me someone know in chat if there's a actual cloud that automates Nomad. Because one of the advantages of using Kubernetes, even though it's really complicated, is it has lots of functionality. It has a huge ecosystem. So just about anything you need to do, there's a solution for that. And the reality is nowadays is you don't have to run your own Kubernetes. One of my biggest problems over the years is having to maintain your own Kubernetes cluster. But we now have Fargate. We now have auto-managed clusters in every major cloud where you don't even have to patch the nodes anymore. You don't even know how many nodes you have. You're never manually messing with SSH. You're just telling it the workloads to run, and it runs them. And that's pretty awesome. That takes away a lot of the burden of maintaining Kubernetes. You're still going to have to deal with all of your add-ons and plugins, but that's getting easier too. EKS now has managed plugins so that they can help you install it and maintain it. So as long as you understand manifest files and you know how things are going to work at a basic level in Kubernetes, that might work for you. But if you're someone who needs just a couple dozen containers and it's just you doing the job and you're only doing it part-time, I would argue you don't use any of those. That you just go to the cloud, if you can use the cloud, and you run their version, like App Runner on AWS, I think is what it's called, Google Cloud Run on Google. ACI isn't what I'm thinking of, but there's basically another service on Azure that is similar, where you're writing a slightly different specification, but it's not as complicated to write as Kubernetes. It's a little bit more complicated maybe than Compose, but it's a lot less work than Kubernetes. Basically, there might be Kubernetes there, but you don't know it because you don't have to deal with it. And so that's whenever I talk to a really small team, doesn't have a dedicated Kubernetes admin, that's what I try to get them to use first. If they can't do that, then I try to get them to use a fully managed Kubernetes solution like, any of them. EKS, Fargate, for example. Pay that extra money because it's cheaper than a DevOps engineer. It's always cheaper than a DevOps engineer. And that's what you're going to need. You're going to need a Kubernetes admin if you're going to manage your own clusters in real-world production deployments. You're going to need someone who spends most of their day dealing with the management of Kubernetes. And not everybody has that. So the last thing I want you to do is to get into something that's too much work and you can't maintain it. Because one of the problems with Kubernetes is people are letting their clusters get real old. I mean, we get 3 releases a year now, and that's slower than it used to be. It used to be 4 a year. And you shouldn't be more than a couple of versions out of date. But a lot of people I see are stuck on version 20, 21, and we're at 26 now, right? We're at 25, 26. That's where we're at right now. And you don't get patches on 19 and 20 as far as I know anymore. So it's a process. I just watched a small team trying to manage their EKS. It wasn't Fargate. They were doing EKS, and they were trying to update their cluster, which was so old they were going to have to do 4 major updates. Or, it's technically minor versions, but 4 big updates. And in order to do that, they had to upgrade their CSI, which they didn't even know what CSI was. They didn't use it, but it had to be updated first. And it was a process, and it was labor, and it was days of consulting that they had to spend on me to help them. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to avoid that. So think of Kubernetes as it's a private cloud solution for your company and treat it as such. Try to use as much auto-managed services as possible. And that will save you time and money. Even though they are more expensive, they're always cheaper than engineers. So anyway, that's enough of that soapbox. What is a great multi-cluster dashboard tool? Good question, Julio. So dashboards are kind of getting fragmented. Do you mean a web dashboard? Do you mean a desktop dashboard? Lens is getting more and more towards a paid solution. There is still InfraApp, infra.app, and there's a new player out that has a desktop GUI, but it's a paid solution. I can't think of the name of it. Someone on Twitter mentioned it last week, and I didn't write it down. But in terms of web dashboards, I mean, you can start with the Kubernetes dashboard, the official one. Obviously, it's not the best. It's going to be the minimum, right? But what I see teams doing is fracturing, having multiple dashboards depending on your focus. Are you a developer focused on deployments? I love Argo CD for that. Argo CD has a great web dashboard that's focused around the deployment lifecycle, deployment updates, doing rolling updates. Are things working during the update? Did it have to roll back? Which version are you on in your apps? Like all those questions that devs really care about. It's not so much an operator tool for cluster operations, but it can do multi-cluster, right? Ranchers got a very mature GUI that supports multi-cluster. So it's a little more complicated to set up. It's got more things you got to do. In fact, when you hire a rancher, their plan is to create a cluster of clusters. They will create a management cluster. That's all it does, and it runs the GUI. And then you have a bunch of other clusters that it will actually automate and deploy for you in the management cluster. So that's a very advanced tool that will take you a little bit of time to fully appreciate and grok. There are very specific tools that are web dashboards like Komodor, Komodor, I believe. Komodor will help you troubleshoot, and they just got a whole bunch of new funding. They got like $70 million of round B funding or Series B funding. So Komodor is one that will help you troubleshoot and help you see what's going on in your Kubernetes cluster. And it's got competition. There's lots of competition out there. But they've been around a minute, and they've also got funding, so they have a better shot. Of course, if you're going with a distribution, you're always going to probably have to run the dashboard of your distribution. So that's one that you're going to end up running. So I think at the end of the day, you're probably going to have 2, maybe 3 dashboards. You're also going to find that a lot of the security companies and security tools now they're leaning towards bringing you into a dashboard. Weave has this. Traffic now has their own dashboard for managing clusters. So a lot of them are going towards niching to a specific problem set. Maybe you care more about networking. Maybe you care more about security. Maybe you're just a cluster operator, or maybe you're a developer. Those are maybe like the 4 personas that I would see, and each of them is turning into each of them having their own tool rather than like a mega web dashboard that everyone's using and it's just got 1,000 features. Because all these things usually need is access to the API. In some cases, they might need stuff on the cluster itself, like agents. For that, you might look at Portainer, which is a very popular dashboard that now supports Kubernetes. So it supports Docker, Swarm, and Kubernetes, and you can manage multiple clusters all from one web interface. They've been around a very long time and seem to be quite successful. They were on this show a year ago, as well as Komodor. Komodor was on this show, I think, like 2 years ago. Portainer was on this show, I think, about a year ago. So those are maybe some of my favorites. I would have to know more about your team and what your focus is, what you're trying to get out of it, what your problems are, before I'd recommend just one. Jonathan's saying the biggest problem with Nomad is it's lacking documentation. Yeah, I mean, one of Nomad's big claims to fame is that it's more than just containers. It can run services on the host. I just don't do that. I mean, once I went container, I went all container. I went all in. So, how do I update services on a server? That's something I don't want to deal with. I want to be able to deploy my container in Argo and just let it automatically update. I don't want to have to deal with services. So I look at that feature of Nomad, and while some may be okay with that, I'm all in on containers. So if you can't put it in a container, I don't really want to run it on my servers. far as I'm concerned, the server OS just needs to have Docker in it and all the minimum required system services. It don't even need a package manager. But it's weird. We're still all using Ubuntu. Like that's the number one OS that I see people using. Is Linux is Ubuntu. Obviously, if you're on Amazon, you're using Amazon Linux. You got Azure Linux. But in the cloud and for the clients that I work with, Ubuntu seems to be the major pick. Not that the other ones are bad. It's just Ubuntu's popular. So -0, you're most welcome. Thanks for being here. Dan's asking, do you have any recommendation on cluster and worker node size per environment? As big as possible, as big as you can afford. No, but what I really mean is it's much better in my mind, especially when you're talking about the cloud, to go big with less instances. So if you were to build your own cluster from scratch, you need minimum of 3 nodes for the control plane. I would recommend if it's a business production scenario, those are dedicated nodes that they don't run extra work. So 3 nodes just for the control plane. You can go 5, but you need either 3 or 5 to be fault tolerant. And those nodes can be sized smaller, and then as your needs grow, smaller meaning, give them 8 gig of RAM and 4 CPUs or something like that. And then as you grow, you just swap one out at a time because they're fault tolerant. So you can take one down, size it up to a new instance size, and then roll through the other 2. And now you're more capacity. You can handle, maybe you have better IO, better networking. One of the biggest things with Kubernetes management is this networking speed. So you never want an instance so small that you're not getting a minimum 1 gigabit of networking. You always, on every node in Kubernetes, Swarm, I don't care what it is, you want 1 gigabit networking because the node agents are talking every second. And that creates not necessarily a gigabit of traffic, but if you start going on the really cheap instances, right, the minis, the micros, the tinies and stuff, if you start doing that, you may get into a place, especially on AWS, where you have sub-gigabit networking and you will potentially start having failures or what we call node failures or management node failures where things start to flip in and out and it looks like they're going offline, but really what it is it's just a networking bottleneck. So I never implement anything that on Kubernetes or Swarm that doesn't have at least a gigabit of networking. By the way, if you go ARM, you get really fast networking. So I love doing the new ARM instances. I love ARM. If you can run everything in ARM, then great. It's cheaper, it's faster, better bang for your buck. At least on AWS. I think they're one of the few that are running ARM right now. But they got their own Graviton processors, so it's pretty dope. I think at least 50% savings on the overall cost. So long story longer there, excuse me, once you have your management nodes, your regular nodes, if it was me managing a cluster for someone, I would look at all the things we're going to run, all the monitoring tools, all the apps, all the web GUIs, all the things, management included that I'm going to need to run the cluster. And I would try to guesstimate what that's going to be up front in terms of RAM and CPU. Hopefully these are things that some of them are running elsewhere so I can get a sense of their real utilization. And so I'm going to right size my servers, but I'm probably going to scale up at least 50% to 100% more than that just to be careful because I don't want to have major failures out of the gate because everybody will blame Kubernetes. And that's not Kubernetes' fault. It's my fault for not giving enough resources. So what I'll do initially is I'll scale up to 5 nodes in the cluster. And then I'll have those 5 nodes. And then as they need more resources, as those get full, I will add more servers up to around 10. This is not an exact science. This is just my approach. And then after 10, I will reapproach and reevaluate the node size and go to a bigger node. Generally, I can save money with bigger nodes. You always need buffers. You always need headroom, right? And I find that you can get away with overall less waste and less headroom if you're sizing your nodes large. So to me, it's cheaper to run 10 instances. Let's see if I do the math right. If I have 10 instances with 8 CPUs each, so that's 80 CPUs, I'd rather do that than 80 servers with 1 CPU or 40 servers with 2 CPUs, right? I would rather have less machines to manage, less operational overhead, And I want at least 5 so I can easily do rolling updates. The idea is that I want to be able to have 1 or 2 fail while I also have 1 down for maintenance. Like say I'm doing maintenance on something, then 1 or 2 fail, and I still have redundancy, right? I still have at least critical workloads running. So maybe that's a worst case scenario, but I try to look at it and say, okay, in a 5-node cluster, I have the equivalent of 1 node free of resources. That way, if 1 goes down or I need to reboot or replace it, the rest of the nodes can all handle the capacity of the workloads moving over. If you're in a more conservative environment, you might require 2 of those nodes in additional capacity. So it's not that you're usually running 2 nodes empty. It's that you have enough overhead that maybe you can, and you might have to do that to begin with on spreadsheets. Eventually, you're going to find tools that do this for you, that calculate your cost and look at your, if you just basically look around, there's a ton of projects and companies working on Kubernetes cost analysis. That's kind of what they're doing here. So I think the future, AI is going to do this all for us if it doesn't already do it now. But hopefully that gives you a sense of how I would size a cluster if I was doing it all manually by myself. I don't like 20 small systems, right? Or 20 larges. I don't want to do that. It's too many servers for me to manage. I want 5 to 10, double XLs. If, for the same amount of money, I can get much more resources in fewer nodes and have less to deal with. So that's my strategy. All right. Great question. Non-prod versus prod. You're saving these questions up for me. Do I use namespace for dev, test, QA, and non-prod and stage, and prod and namespace, or in the prod environment? Is 1 control plane and 3 worker nodes a good start? Yeah, 1 control. So as you grow, you're never going to have just 1 cluster. You never should have 1 cluster. The absolute minimum for anyone listening to this, if you're going to run Kubernetes, the minimum cluster count is 2. 1 for you to break, so it's non-critical workloads, and 1 for critical workloads. I don't necessarily separate my developer QA or my developer team's staging to a separate cluster. I don't match staging workloads to staging cluster. I don't do that because eventually you're going to end up with way too many clusters with very few resources. So I'd rather have fewer larger clusters, but I'm never going to have less than 2. Maybe in a team environment where I've got a team of DevOps people, we're going to have 3. The first cluster maybe only has 1 node for control plane, and maybe it's got 2 workers. So it's there for alpha testing our own stuff. It's going to be running the same configs as production, the same version matches production, but before I want to change cluster or change configuration or deploy a new ingress controller or anything like that, anything that's my responsibility, I'm going to be doing on that cluster. I'm going to be doing that first as a smoke test. That's what I call it, a smoke test. You can automate a lot of this too. You can have this stuff automated in that cluster through GitHub Actions or CI, where you're deploying all those things before you go to the next cluster. So the next cluster is very similar to that, but the difference is on this cluster, you're going to run workloads that someone cares about. It may not be your customers, and it should not be your customers, but maybe it's someone in your team that cares about it. Maybe it's going to be a problem if it goes down. Maybe you don't get a call in the middle of the night if it goes down, but you do have to work on it first thing the next morning when you come into work because someone in IT needs it. Or maybe it's the sales team demos that they use for sales cycles, right? So it's something that it'll be a problem if during the day it's not up, but it's not being used at 3 a.m. The reason you need this, and this is something that I've learned over breaking things for 30 years, you need something that's going to give you a gut check before you go to straight production. You need something that it's gonna hurt if you break it, but it's not going to be your job, right? And so I don't know what you want to call that. You can call that staging, call it test, whatever you want. But the goal there is to run less critical workloads, ideally not customer facing. Maybe it's all the testing workloads for your customers. But don't think of it as a production cluster for testing workloads. You think of it as a cluster that you're going to deploy to before you go to production. You're going to deploy your infrastructure changes there. So your infrastructure changes are going on the beta cluster. Then if that works, that's the smoke test. Then on this staging cluster, that's an infrastructure staging cluster. And then your production cluster or clusters. Eventually, you will have more than one production cluster. You might have a production cluster per region. You might have a production cluster per billable unit of your organization that depends on the cost capturing, so that you can bill sales and you can bill support and marketing have their own clusters because they have that type of billing if you don't have centralized IT billing. So that production outlook is going to be dependent upon your organization, upon how many clouds you need. Are you hybrid? How many production clusters you have there really depends on your org. But those other two, I always do. And that staging one in the middle needs to be fault tolerant and you need to have monitoring on it, because what you need to be doing there is testing your node updates, testing your Kubernetes updates, testing the latest CSI or CNI, any of your plugins that you're using. You don't want to be testing and learning about those in production. So you want this other cluster that's, I call it like the gut check moment, right? Like, if I break this, my team's going to give me a little tease and I might be getting a support ticket, right? But it's not going to be critical down, all hands on deck, someone's on the phone at 3 a.m. That's what I really like. Because what I find is, if I don't give engineers, I've run teams before where if we didn't have that, they're very scared of production outages. Like they are hesitant to click that button to deploy to production for any infrastructure change, because they haven't really been able to test it in the real world. They haven't had real workloads on it yet. So they're not really sure if that storage driver has a write bug that slows down the performance 50%, right? There's all kinds of stuff that happens in infrastructure. So you really want that cluster, but you don't want it to be your critical stuff, right? Hopefully that helps. That's been something that I have honed over the last 30 years, and it's not Kubernetes specific. It is everything I do with teams of DevOps or ops people. I come from the sysadmin background, so we do that. I prefer that approach. And there's probably better names, like Google and Netflix and the Microsofts of the world. They all probably have better names for this type of approach. I just don't know those names. That's a great question, and that's a topic I'm very passionate about. Dan's winning it today, by the way, for those of you keeping track, competition. Oh, I accidentally clicked the wrong button there. So yeah, good questions. Wondering why are some drag and drop tools for infrastructure provisioning emerging, like Brainboard, Harpoon? Well, I mean, I think every tool that we're using today is going to go AI and visual as soon as it can. Google Cloud now has a visual tool based on the open source project, Scala-Draw. Google Cloud, a Google engineer over COVID, created a Scala-Draw. It's a fantastic drawing tool. Some of you probably use it and know about it. It looks like your handwriting when you draw. And Google Cloud took that and extended it to you draw in their version of it, and then it will implement the Google Cloud infrastructure. Why wouldn't we want to do that? Like, I was trying to deploy infrastructure with Visio 15 years ago or more. And it was very hard, and it was very limited, and it didn't always work. So we have come a long way with that. But there are not enough ops and DevOps professionals in the world, right? They say that for every one of us, there's two jobs. There's the job we have, and there's the job that needs someone to fill it. And there's a job posting somewhere on the internet. AWS has like 30,000 job openings. 30,000, last I checked. So they're not all DevOps jobs, but you get my meaning. So because there's not enough of us, there are people that are not qualified, in my definition, doing those jobs. There are people that it's the best we could get, or it's someone who doesn't even want to do the job, but the manager forced them to do it. They need these tools. They need AI. They need guardrails and things like AI in the future, and maybe it's just starting a little bit now, but more in the future. Those are going to be the guardrails that will allow easy people to deploy infrastructure easier and easier. It's the same thing as why DigitalOcean exists. DigitalOcean exists is because AWS is complicated. If AWS wasn't complicated, DigitalOcean wouldn't have a leg to stand on, or Linode, or whatever. So I think it's a matter of why what is the expertise of the person that needs to deploy the infrastructure? Most of us, if you're comfortable in YAML and you want to just live in YAML, great. But sometimes I try GUI tools and I find out that they're actually better than what I can do in programming or CLI. For example, I'm a Vim fan. I have been a Vim fan since I think 1995. It was VI back then, 1998 or something like that. And of course, now I'm a Neo-Vim fan, but I don't really use it anymore. I use VS Code because I get a way superior experience, in my opinion. It's fast enough. It's not the fastest, but it's fast enough for most of my use. And it's got way more convenience features, and it doesn't break all the time. I'm constantly breaking my Vim plugins. And so we can evolve, right? I used to be someone who was like diehard shell everything, but I don't SSH into servers that much anymore. I don't manage servers that much anymore because the cloud's doing it for me. So I don't need to be the SSH command line guru that I once needed to be. I need to spend more time on learning all these new tools for managing that without the shell. Just because that's the way that things are going. So I think we all need to evolve, and I think that, someone who's extremely proficient at the command line can still be really fast, but eventually, the AI is coming for the jobs. So eventually, we're all going to be AI managers. We're going to be managing tools that are making decisions for us at varying degrees and at varying levels. Auto-scaling, you could argue that auto-scaling is a very, very simplistic AI. It's making decisions based on the instructions you gave it. So it's got automation. I wouldn't really qualify it as AI, but it's very simplistic, right? In terms of it's not making decisions that you never explicitly gave it. But if you think about it, auto-scaling, vertical, horizontal, pod auto-scaling, there's 3 different kinds. And if you add all those together, your system looks pretty sophisticated and it's making financial decisions on your behalf. So that's like one step away from machine learning, which is one step away from AI. So we're not far off from this stuff just being a lot of click and drag, and you have to know the right tools. And I think that's part of what the future of DevOps is you're not going to be hired because you're the guru in one tool. You're going to be hired, like a lot of us are hired today, because you know the ecosystem. You know the tools that you need to get the job done. You may not be the smartest person in those tools because they change. They constantly change. And tools replace other tools. So how can you be an expert on everything? You just can't. But if you know where to go find those tools, if you know the guy to go ask about the container tool, that's the value. The other value thing of DevOps is that you're sharing. You've got to share everything you learn. Share in your company. Share with your team. Share with people, even when they don't ask. Share on Slack. Write blogs about it. Put it in open source. The people that I hire and the teams that I help hire, if they don't share, if they're not already sharing what they're learning, if I don't see how they're learning, if they're not teaching me and making me better, they're not worth hiring, in my opinion, because that's the new currency. It's not what you know, it's what you share. And so in the future, everything you know now will be obsolete. And but if you know how to find the information and you can find it quickly and you can intelligently understand it, because you have that background, you're going to have that fundamentals in networking, fundamentals in Linux, fundamentals in the cloud, and then you work your way up the stack, fundamentals in containers, right? And if you have that stuff, it will serve you your entire career. Guess what? We're all still using TCP version 4, most of us. Maybe if you're not in China. Maybe if you're in China, you're using 6. Most of us have not moved to 6 yet. I learned TCP IP4 in 1995, maybe in 94, but I remember buying the book at Barnes & Noble at 1995, and I learned it, and I've been using it ever since. So those fundamentals at the very low levels don't change very often. The way that storage works and the rules of storage haven't really changed in 30 years. They've just gotten faster with newer technology, but the fundamentals are still the same. So I always encourage people to go get those fundamentals. Starting with Linux, starting with networking, then go to the cloud, then learn containers. I don't know if anyone's asking that question, but I'm sort of ranting on that. Yeah, but that's a great question, Newton. Like that's the trend we're seeing, right? Is you're also seeing the no-code movement, right? And so along with the no-code movement, why is that happening? Because we need more developers, and there's not enough of us. So they've got to create tools for people that can't develop to do the work that a developer used to do. I mean, some of us were running SharePoint 20 years ago, and that was the reason they made SharePoint, was regular users can now make web pages that don't require development. And we're still doing that 20 years later. So it's a thing. So James is here with a problem. Let's see if we can solve it. We have devices connected to an internal VPN in Azure and a Kubernetes cluster in Azure with a service. We have to connect everything internally. There's no question there, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to help you with that. So if you're trying to troubleshoot a very specific thing, like in this case with gens or hens, I would probably recommend going to the Discord server, because then you can chat about it over time and you can share screenshots, you can share configs. There's a lot of people there, and people can show up and have problems. We can't always fix them for you, but we can try. So that might be a better place than you chatting in small little chats here. Can I have in the same cluster Windows and Linux nodes? Yes. Great question, Julio. You can have worker nodes in Kubernetes and in Swarm be Windows servers, right? I think Windows Server 2022, I think is the latest. You can do that, but your management nodes have to be Linux. So you're going to have Linux somewhere in there to manage the cluster. Your control plane, I think, only supports Linux as far as I know. Bebjan? It's hard. I'm not sure how to say that. Bebjan. Hello, I need Kubernetes for orchestration in my diploma thesis for IT, and I don't know what to do. You need Kubernetes for orchestration in your diploma thesis. Well, I'm not sure what you're asking. Are you asking, do you need to learn Kubernetes? Because I have courses, and they're below with coupons that get you them for very cheap. So if you need to learn Kubernetes, it's probably one of my fastest ways that I could recommend learning it. If you already know Docker, buy my Kubernetes Mastery course, right? If you go over to my website, the reason I made 2 courses on this is I made Docker Mastery. That's the first one. I made Docker Mastery, which teaches you Swarm and Kubernetes. But I made that one as like it's a holistic approach. It teaches you lots of things, but it doesn't always go super deep, right? Because there's already, I think we're closing in on 200 videos, over 21 hours of video content. So it can't go as deep as I'd like, because it would just end up being 50, 60 hours of video. So I start making other courses that go deeper. For example, the Docker plus Swarm course goes deeper into Swarm. Then you learn Swarm in the basic course, but then it repeats that and also goes deeper into Swarm. Same with Node.js. It teaches you deeper internals of Docker, of how to use it specifically in JavaScript projects for Node.js. You could actually take that course and learn a lot about how to use it with Python and Ruby and stuff too, but I just use Node.js as the example there. But Kubernetes Mastery assumes you know Docker and starts there, and then teaches you more in depth. I would say that the Kubernetes Mastery course is my most technical Kubernetes content. It doesn't teach everything. It's only 10 hours. So it can't go into all the add-ons, adding on Helm, which is technically an add-on, adding on CNIs and CSIs. It doesn't go into all those projects. But it does try to get you the foundations that you need to start using Kubernetes, and it goes more technical than Docker Mastery does. So check that out. If you already know Docker and you need to learn Kubernetes fast, check that one out. And hopefully this year will be the year that I can add more videos to that. If we don't need to, right now I'm in the middle of more updates for Docker. I have logging videos that have to be fixed, and then we have a new section coming. Even though we just released 2 new sections, we have another section coming on more in-depth Dockerfile stuff for more details. But yeah, Simon, what's up? How do you connect your home lab Kubernetes cluster to GitHub to trigger actions on it? Are you talking about a runner, Simon? Are you talking about running GitHub runners? Or are you saying you want an action, maybe that's what you're saying, GitHub action step to reach out and use kube control on your cluster? If so, and you're not willing to open a high port, because what you can do, because Kubernetes by default has authentication, so you can use something to create another user. Maybe, I don't know if you need admin or not, but you have the root admin when you create a Kubernetes cluster. Your keys cluster, your K3s cluster has the admin certificate by default. So you could put that in and then put it on a really high port, right? On a random high port. Use on your home firewall, like take, the Kubernetes API. You're going to need to make a service to make it public on the server, depending on how your K3s is set up. It may not be public on that machine on your local networks. You need to figure that out. It might be publishing the Kubernetes service. It might be changing a configuration in your deployment. Depends on what you're doing. But once you get that to where you can get to it from another machine on your network, then you need to go to your home router and route that port from a really high random port, like let's say 32567, right? Then in your step in GitHub Actions, if you're running a kube control command or something in GitHub Actions, you're going to need to store that in a secret inside your GitHub repo. So you're going to go into GitHub repo, settings, actions, add a secret that stores that information. And then you're going to, maybe you're going to have a shell script in your GitHub action that basically passes that to your config, saves it to a file, however you're going to do it, so that you can connect with that authentication. Now what you have is you have a high random port so that you're less likely to get brute forced, and you're still using authentication. That's a really basic home lab setup, right? You don't need to necessarily go create extra user accounts and RBAC on Kubernetes. That's for a home lab, you don't necessarily need to do that. But if you wanted to go through that, then you would need to learn RBAC and learn what tool you need to use with Kubernetes in your cluster to meet your needs. My favorite one recently that's amazingly easy for that, we had him on the show, Infra HQ. We had Matt on the show from Infra HQ. So it's really a really slick little UI that talks to Kubernetes and allows you to connect remotely. I don't exactly know if it provides tunneling. So that's a question. It might actually do that. So one of the other ways you can do it is if you get one of these tools, Teleport. What was the other one I just saw the other day? I actually talk about it in my newsletter that's launching later today. I mentioned some of these tools, but if you just look up Kubernetes VPN or something like that, there are tools that will basically reach out from your cluster and connect to a middle server, basically a cloud SaaS. And it doesn't require you to open a port on your home firewall. It does require you to use a specialized tool. Maybe Infra can do that. And there's another one. There's Teleport. Oh, that's the documentation. Oops. That's another one. It might be more fancy than you really need. I can't think of the third one. I forgot already. But I would try out Infra at first if you wanted to do something like create a limited scoping token that maybe only has access to the namespace that you need the GitHub action to have access to, right? That would be much more of a production-like setup, but if you want to experiment within your home lab, you can do that. Good question. All right. That's a great question, Simon. Let me know if you have any more questions on that. All right, let's see. What else? Jonathan's back. Let's see. Is there a viable open source storage clustering solution for Docker Swarm? I see a lot of obsolete, unmaintained plugins such as Cluster, FS, and RexRay, but couldn't find a recent tutorial on the topic. So that's kind of why we're getting ready to, we're hoping to launch, with the help of the community, a Swarm Awesome, sort of like a Swarm Awesome list, so that maybe we can help centralize a lot of these projects, because the list is short, right? The only one that I can think of off the top of my head right now is Portworx. I do believe they still support a Swarm plugin. In fact, let me pull that up just to make sure. So this is still here. I'm assuming that still means it works. But Portworx is a paid-for solution. It's free, I think, for 3 nodes, but more than that, you have to pay. So check them out. There's also Ceph, right? There's the open source tools that you could technically install outside of outside of the Swarm plugin system. Lastly, we're hoping, no guarantees, but we're hoping that with the release of Docker version 23 this year, the new big version of Docker Engine, that we're going to get an update in SwarmKit, which has seen significant commits and PRs around establishing CSI support for Swarm, which means if someone can update, you have to create a shim or a plugin to allow the plugin, but basically for a supported list, you will be able to use Kubernetes CSIs inside of Swarm, which would be amazing, right? That would be awesome. That effort is led by Mirantis, and I'm excited about the potential for that. So I'm hoping to have a show this quarter. In fact, I need to write that down because I need to remember to ask them. We're going to do a show, hopefully, to talk about that. Maybe I'll wait to do the show until we're closer to the release date so that we kind of know exactly what's going to be in it and what's going to happen. But that's possible. But until then, try Portworx. There might be some other people here that can help you. Also, join in our Discord server and ask that in the Swarm channel. There are several people there currently running Swarm in production. I no longer run it in production. And when I did, I ran RexRay because I loved RexRay. It worked. It was easy. But yeah, it's no longer a maintained project. So it technically can work because none of the other stuff has changed. But any bugs that are in it aren't getting fixed, right? So I think I did use RexRay just a few years ago on DigitalOcean, and it worked fine. Hopefully that helps. What use cases for stateful sets? Databases. That's basically the only. Databases are really old, high complexity monolith legacy apps, which I don't recall the last time I needed one of those. But databases, especially where you need to create a database cluster and the names matter, the names of the pods, they need to be persistent so that they can find each other, and that you're not going to use services in front of them or something like that. So honestly, they're rare for me because when I work with a team, we don't run our own databases in production. Like we're always using cloud database hosting. I do work with one company that runs their own data center and they have their own Microsoft SQL servers, but those aren't in Kubernetes. Those are on dedicated hosts and they have a dedicated SQL team. So we do run plenty of MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB, all those things in testing and QA and stuff like that, simply for rapid iteration and rapid testing and destroying them. But we don't really care about performance so much there, and fault tolerance. So we're not really doing operators. When you find some of these operators on Kubernetes, there are operators for some of these databases, and they may use stateful sets for you. It just really depends on what they need. It's very much up to the specific database technology and whether it needs stable IPs, stable names, that kind of thing. So it's a great question. Thank you. What is the DevOps path? I get that question a lot. I don't have a very formal approach or a course, But generally, I have notes and thoughts, and I won't repeat them here unless you have specific questions. I will send you my little short link that basically takes you to my AMA. Did you know about my AMA? I have an AMA. It's not in Discord. You can ask questions in Discord all day long. But if you want to go to a permanent place that's searchable on the internet and ask a question, come over to GitHub in my AMA. And this is a question that's 5 years old now. And I'm just going to put that in the chat there. So you can read through that. It's a lot of my thoughts on what's the priorities, what you should be focusing on. There are a few resource links for things that you can go through, including links to other people's courses or resources for finding your path. I think with DevOps, the biggest thing that I see is that people feel overwhelmed with the amount of tools they need to learn. And I think that really the first thing you're going to need to do when you first start DevOps is you're going to need to learn the foundations of why it exists. You're not going to learn tools. Tools are what you learn in order to implement the DevOps mindset, the DevOps practices. And so you have to know the mindset and the fundamentals first. This is largely about workflows, about metrics, about understanding why DevOps had to exist. So the first thing you should do is read the DevOps handbook. I think that's in that list there. They just recently released the DevOps handbook 2nd edition. I have it in both digital form and audiobook because I have a hard time getting through reading books, but I can listen to them. So the 2nd edition just came out last year, I believe, or at the end of 2021. That is the Bible for DevOps. You want to read that, and that's going to give you a lot of the premise. If you're more of a course person, you're going to go back to that list, and you're going to go down, and I point to a course that I should make myself or get at least some sort of referral credits for, but I don't. It's a link to LinkedIn's course on DevOps Foundations. I only recommend this one because I've taken some of it. I've skimmed through it when I had access to it. And the two guys, James and Ernest, are out of Texas, out of Austin, I believe, which is one of the original DevOps Days conferences. So these gentlemen know their stuff. And it's a well-produced course, high value and high production quality, like my own. They do a great job. And they focus on the culture, the processes, and the why. You've got to know that first. If you go and try to learn containers for DevOps and you don't know the fundamentals of why DevOps exists, you're not going to know why you need to use Docker or how you should use Docker. Because you can, like any tool, you can use tools wrongly or you can use them the DevOps way. And once you know those fundamentals, then you can start to look at the tooling courses. If you go to Udemy, almost all their courses are on tooling. And they might teach you some very, very, very basics, but they don't really focus on the DevOps foundations. There's also a company called the DevOps Institute. And you'll find other stuff around the web. But when you're first starting out, shy away from things that are like, learn DevOps now, Jenkins, Ansible, Terraform, Docker. That's not day one. That's after you've read the book, after you've taken another course on the fundamentals of DevOps concepts. That will serve you your entire career because DevOps isn't really versioned. You're not going to grow outdated in your DevOps knowledge in 5 years. You might need to learn new tools, but all we're doing is continuing the learning of implementing the same ideas. We want to be able to be agile. We want to measure everything we can measure so that we know whether we're getting better, not just as a person, but as a team in our performance of our systems. How fast can we recover from failure? How fast can we deploy a new version? How fast can we go from idea to production, right? Which involves lots of people. So those are all the fundamentals that you have to know first. Learning a tool isn't going to help you if you don't know those fundamentals. That's a great question. Jonathan's back. Sorry. Would it be okay to run a database on Portworx or Ceph? Sure. you have to realize that your storage is not going to replicate your database. That's not how it works. And so I'm sorry if I'm assuming that you don't understand that. You maybe know all this, and I'm teaching you something you already know. But if you don't realize it, databases have to do database replication themselves and database backups themselves. So your storage platform is really there for, if it's for databases, it's not there to replicate anything. It's there to get your storage off disk. All right. More importantly, it's there to make sure that if that pod crashes and then comes up on a different node, that the storage is over there on that node, which usually means you need, if you're talking about your own servers, you're talking about Fiber Channel, iSCSI, NAS, SAN, basically, all these external storage solutions. If you're in the cloud, like if you're in AWS, you're going to be using EC2, excuse me, EC2's EBS disks, and those can be reattached to different servers. And so you're going to be using drivers, to do that. So with Swarm, I basically, when teams tell me they need to run databases on Swarm, I tell them to go Kubernetes because we just don't, other than Portworx, we don't really have a lot of these good options today. There might be a few people in the Discord server, again, in the Swarm channel, that have different opinions on that. Excuse me, sorry. My coughing today. It's horrible. But that's because they've done stuff and it's worked. Over the years, I've had people that have used Ceph and it's worked, but it's complicated. It's technical. You have to know storage, and you have to pay attention to it. And it's not as easy as just running a container. So when people tell me, yeah, I've got specialized storage solution needs and I need storage drivers or some sort of custom third-party storage in my Swarm cluster, I say, okay, as of today, don't do it. Go Kubernetes because it has the rich ecosystem of storage drivers. Sorry, you're just going to have to do that. Or go cloud. You don't have to worry about it. So that's my unfortunate opinion on that. Someone else might disagree, though. ProRin, what's up? How would I recommend moving workloads, deployments, replica sets, etc., from an old cluster to a new cluster while jumping multiple minor versions? Jumping versions isn't really going to matter. I mean, unless the API version for your specification for your deployments has changed, which it probably hasn't in the last 10 versions of Kubernetes. So I doubt that's an issue. And if it does, Kubernetes, when you try to do a kube control apply on that new cluster, it will immediately fail and say you don't have the right, we don't support that version anymore because it's a beta or whatever. So there's little risk in that. So I wouldn't worry about versions of Kubernetes when it comes to your apps. That has to do more with Kubernetes plugins, operators, CRDs, right? If you had an older version of Kubernetes and got a brand new version, you're probably going to be using the newer Ingress version. You might be using external storage drivers that are not in tree, as they call it. So the legacy storage drivers were built into Kubernetes. Now we're all using external plugins and operators. So other than that, I assume you have a load balancer outside. If you're looking for like as close to zero downtime as you can get it, you're going to have to run it in parallel, right? Hopefully you have stateless apps, or if they're stateful apps like web apps with cookies or something that you have on the back end, you're going to need to figure out a way, maybe on the new cluster, you figure out a way where your new cluster nodes have to talk to the database that's on the old cluster, and then you're going to have to replicate the old database to the new cluster across clusters. And then you're going to have, so that it gets really complicated, but it's very, very, very specific to the workload, right? If you told me you have a web app, it's stateless, or it's sticky because it's in the browser, and you're using sticky sessions with an external load balancer in the cloud, I'm going to say, well, it's easy. Yeah, you just take both clusters, you're going to spin them both up, you're going to run the apps on both clusters at the same time. Doesn't even matter if they're the same version or not. And then you're going to configure that load balancer to load across all of it, or phase in the new one, or you can just flip the switch right on the load balancer. You can have both you could have two different load balancers running, and then make the switch when you change DNS. And then you're basically having to wait for DNS time to live. And so let's say that's 5 minutes. So then after 5 minutes, all your users are probably using the new server. So unless you have long polling or WebSock. I mean, so that's what I'm saying. It's like it's super specific to the app. How does it connect? Is it stateful, stateless? Is it open TCP connections for long periods of time? Are they doing massive file uploads that might take hours? It just really, really depends on the workloads. But in terms of the versions of things, I wouldn't worry about that in terms of your apps on manifests or, customize YAML. If you have more questions on that, feel free. Ask away. Dan says, I have 6 microservices and I'm finding it a pain to deploy all of the YAML everywhere. Works great in Docker Compose. Is this where Argo CD comes in? So if you're in Compose today, what I would recommend is use Compose with a K to create your first manifests, so you can get a sense of what those look like. If you're new to manifest, pod manifest, then you're going to look at my pod spec, because my pod spec repo, available here, will give you my best practices for a full-featured pod spec in a production Kubernetes cluster. It's really just one file, but everything you do is going to have a pod spec. Anything you run as an app in Kubernetes is a pod, whether it's a deployment, a replica set, the stateful sets, the daemon sets. Have a pod spec inside them. They all, at some point, you'll see spec containers. So I put in the probes. I put in the resource reservations and limits. I lock down the security. I make sure that the timeout on shutdown is correct. I do more security stuff, and I explain a lot of that here. So watch that. There's also a video on PodSpec on the front page of my website. So if you're on my website, so bretfisher.com, you go to the front page, that's the video of that repo. Or just go to the repo, and I think I have the video linked. Yeah, walk through this video on YouTube. So you're going to do that. What you're going to end up doing is you're going to use Customize. Don't bother with Helm. Customize will save you keystrokes and save you a lot of YAML. So the basic setup in your Customize is you're going to have all your manifests for your app in one directory, and then you're going to have just the override YAML to override the exact line you need for each deployment, for each environment. So you're going to have a different set of YAMLs for each environment, but it's not going to be the repetitive full copy. Think of it as like an overlay. We had overlays or overrides in Compose, and you have that with Customize with a K. Customize with a K. It's built into Kubernetes, and it is also a standalone tool. It's, I think, very easy to understand because it doesn't use special templating. It doesn't use handlebars. It's just pure YAML. And when you run the command, there is a standard, and you're basically going to tell the command, this is where the files are I want you to run for this specific environment in a specific directory. And then in that directory, you're going to have the overrides. And so you might if you only need to change the image name for each environment, you'll literally have like 1 or 2 YAML files with like 1 or 2 lines on them. And then you'll have your base with all of what used to be composed, but now straight up manifests in Kubernetes. And then the customized part is the layering those other overrides on top. I find it very easy to understand. You do have to learn Customize, but once you've learned it, it feels very natural, unlike Helm, which has its own deployment mechanism, which has its own templating speak, and it gets pretty complicated. And you have to define the chart and have a chart file. And I only recommend Helm for companies that need to offer their software to others as a packaged solution. That's when Helm is really necessary, unless you're in a very complicated shop. The rest of us can all get away with Customize. So to answer your question, this is a perfect segue to one of my new things. Bret.courses/autodeploy takes you to my upcoming course that, Dan, sounds perfect for you. Because if you're just now getting into manifests, you need to still keep learning that manifest and the Customize. But Argo doesn't replace your YAML for Kubernetes. It's additive. What it does is it saves you from having to run kube control apply and do all that command line stuff yourself, or write scripts to do all that stuff yourself. What it does is it watches repos and or watches images for new versions of these YAML files, your manifests, your customize, or your Helm. And it'll use all three plus a couple other formats, and it will then apply them smartly with a wonderful dashboard that gives you status and helps you understand things as they're happening. You can also edit things and change things in the dashboard, but that's not GitOps approach. So I recommend, if you're interested, if you have the budget and you have the time, we are scheduling the first cohort of my new live workshop. This is a workshop that's going to be focused exactly on this problem. I'm going to show you GitHub Actions for building your images multi-platform with all the latest Docker features, multi-stage, multi-platform, all the fancy stuff, build caches included and image caches in GitHub, multiple registries for CI registries and production registries, all that stuff. You're going to be learning that approach and the basics of that. And then we're going to add Argo, and it's specifically meant for people that are new to automated deployments on Kubernetes. They're not maybe new to the idea of Kubernetes. They've had some time learning it. They know Docker. They know a little bit of the Kubernetes lifestyle, but they haven't yet implemented something like Argo or Flux. So this is basically implementing automation and GitOps. And the way I'm going to do this is it's going to be an hour and a half a day, every other day for 2 weeks. So it's not a huge time commitment. And it's going to be small groups live on Zoom, and we're all going to learn together, and you're going to be able to actually meet the other students that are doing the same thing you're doing. Sometimes we may be doing certain exercises in small groups, and you're going to be trying to implement this in sample projects quickly. Like, this is all about executing and getting you to the real world solutions that you need for your own apps and your own projects in your own company. So ideally, by the end of the 2 weeks, you're already starting to use this and test this on your real workloads. What I find with a lot of people is they got Docker. The team's using Docker. Great. They're starting to use Kubernetes. They started to do that. Great. But they haven't. So maybe they're on a legacy CI. Maybe they're on Jenkins, and they're interested in GitHub Actions, but they don't really know where to get started or how to move their build and test workflows over. And then they also want to improve their deployment mechanism by going to full GitOps using something like Argo CD or Flux. And those tend to be two parts of the same coin, and they have to work together, right? I want to have a PR that's automatically deployed by Argo into my staging cluster. When that PR is approved, I want the image to be rebuilt, rescanned for images, CVE vulnerabilities, retested, uploaded to Docker Hub or GitHub Container Registry. Argo sees it, Argo deploys it to the production cluster. Like, we want that to all happen as much as possible, automatic, as much as you're willing to let it do. So this is a 2-week, very narrow course, high intensity, very targeted for people that are in this specific problem space. It's not a cheap course. It's going to be somewhere between $500 and $700. So think of it as cheap, way cheaper than my consulting, but more expensive than a Udemy course that's generic and it's not customized for you and that sort of thing. So that's what we're going to do. It's going to, like I said, it's all going to be live. You'll be able to be in a community on a special website, on a platform that allows you to share and talk with the community. You're going to have access to all the videos, all the resources throughout the course and forever. But we're going to do it live. And so we're going to keep doing that over and over. But the first one gets the discount. So if y'all are interested, if anyone's interested, go onto that link, bret.courses/auto-deploy, and you can sign up for free. There's nothing to do yet. It's a waiting list. And once we announce the dates, you'll get a significant discount. And you'll be in the first cohort. We're only going to let about 30 people in on the first one, maybe even as few as 10, depending on some things we're doing. We might only let 10 in so we can get better feedback. And basically, we're going to work even more with you to improve the course and make sure it's solid. And then I'm going to start doing this more often, maybe once a quarter, maybe every other month, who knows. And if this goes well, I'm going to ask you all for more topics. We actually had a survey we did last year, and about 50 to 60 of you all filled out a survey on what is the things that you need to learn now and what could I teach you quickly to make you more productive in your job. This was the number one. This was the number one thing that came out of that list, because it was a list of 10 things, and GitHub Actions automation for CI and CD, Argo for GitOps. And that's what we're building. So I'm excited about that. It's starting in March. So you have about 10 weeks before that happens, and we're gonna open it up for signups. And then basically, I think the first 10 or 15 will get into the beta, the first cohort, and then we'll start scheduling the next one out. So yeah. Alex is asking how to join your course. So I'm not sure what you're talking about. If you're talking about the one I just spent 5 minutes on, you go to the link right up in chat. If you're talking about the rest of my courses, links are below. You can either go to bretfisher.com and get my coupons. All my coupons are there. The links are below. Those are for all my Udemy courses. This course I was just talking about is a new type of course that I'm doing live. So it's not quite as custom as consulting, but it's also a lot cheaper. But it's not like the $10 Maven courses or the $15 Maven courses that I often sell. So whichever one you want, they're both there. They're all on my website. You can basically go to bretfisher.com and get all of it, including coupons and discounts. But thanks for that, Alexander. Is there a way for someone to review my little Docker project? That's a great question. So one of the things I would recommend is join the Discord server. That's the Discord server right there. And if you're willing, first, obviously it needs to be an open source. You're gonna have to share it with a group of people. But if you want to go in the Docker channel there, if it's a Docker project or a Compose project, and ask questions, you're gonna need to make sure that the way to get help is to ask very targeted questions. Like, I have this problem. I've described it in my GitHub issue. I don't know how to solve it. Does anyone here? I would love it if someone would take a look. Also, we get this question a lot. Don't ask to ask. Just ask your question. That's a big thing in the community. It's called Don't Ask to Ask, Just Ask. I don't know if you've ever seen this website. But basically, in our community, just like in any chat or forum system, don't ask, hey, can someone help me? Just ask us what you want to ask. And so that's what the DevOps server is for. There's 12,000 people signed up in that thing, and there's always someone in there. Doesn't mean we're going to be able to know your problem or be able to have the fix for you, but we will try. And if it's very specific, the more specific your questions, the better, the more likely you're going to get help. But this is a great little website I send to people. It's also no hello. This is another great one. Don't say hello. Just say what you're going to say. Or combine hello with your thing. It's a pretty great, don't do this. Don't just say hi. So yeah, anyway, join the community and ask for some help. The more you can open source and the more you can describe it in your open source by using a GitHub issue or a GitLab issue or whatever you're using, the better, because we all love to use those tools. That's why they exist. So good luck. Yeah, service meshes do get a lot of discussion. I don't see a terrible amount of people using them. It's almost like it's a journey, right? Your first couple of years in the containers doesn't typically involve service meshes. Service meshes do lots of things. It's not just one thing. And really what they're doing is they're enhancing your networking. So the idea is that you have your containers are providing services, right? So when they're listening on ports, APIs, web servers, and they tend to need to talk to each other. So usually like your front end needs to talk to your API. Well, service meshes can enhance that with monitoring statistics or reading into the packets. Maybe they're providing mutual TLS authentication automatically for you, so you don't have to worry about things encrypted between your front end and back end. So they add a whole layer of various technologies that enhance the inner communication of your apps inside your cluster as they need to talk to each other. That's essentially what service mesh is. Other than that, you have to start getting into each service mesh and why it exists and the features it has, because they're not all the same and there's no standard definition of all the features for service mesh. if you're interested in that, you might want to go over to Meshery, who we had on the show earlier this year. Meshery does a great job with a lot of this stuff, and they have a strong community on learning service meshes and testing various service meshes, even now in Docker Desktop. So the episode on this show, I'm just going to search this and see if it comes up. Yeah, so we had service mesh on this show in September, and it was Lee and Nick from the Meshery group, and they, I'll put this link in here for you if you'd like to go check that out, but they talk a lot about service mesh. We define what service mesh is, and basically Meshery, Mesh has a service mesh, or Meshery has several products. Layer 5 IO is also their website, but they have a plugin for Docker Desktop that makes it really easy for you to deploy a service mesh even on Docker Desktop. And so go check that out. If you're new and you just want to dive in and play around with it and look at GUIs and web interfaces, and you can do that. You can also pit one against the other and do performance benchmarks or run multiple ones at the same time. It's actually really neat. So watch that video. Check that out. Hopefully that helps, Julio. All right, Elam. Simon's asking, what excites me the most in 2023 for DevOps engineer? Probably AI. But, ChatGPT is a shit show. I do not recommend it. If it's even available, it's always busy. Half the time I can't even get it to respond correctly. Yes, 2 days ago, it was responding with other people's answers. I was asking it questions and I was getting completely unrelated content as a response. It was messed up. But we talk about it a lot. We talked about it a lot with several groups of friends. One yesterday in the high fivers, you can join membership on this channel, get access to high fivers. And we were talking about that yesterday in our little video hangout. And I don't know, 50% of the time it's wrong. I don't know what the percentage is, but just go ask at Bret Fisher Docker, and it will be wrong every time about who I am. It will get some things right, and then there's some things wrong that it completely made up about me. And I don't know how anyone would know how to tell which part is right and which part is wrong. It says at one time it said I was a multi-book author. I've never written a book or published a book. I've been in a few books, but I didn't author them, and I'm not listed as an author. But it said I did. One time it says I'm a major contributor to Kubernetes, which I'm not. I've never made a commit to the core Kubernetes repo. So no. What else has it said I've done? And every time it's different, right? So ChatGPT I think of as like the alpha of what we might eventually get to. But what you can see happening is tools are adding AI everywhere. I've had it for a year and a half now in VS Code with Copilot, which I love and I use all day, every day. It finishes my sentences. It finishes my function. So that's a very good use of generative AI. What we're seeing also is in tools that we're all already using, they are adding ChatGPT-like interfaces to the app itself as sort of a beta feature. And again, it's hit or miss. It's very sketchy. It doesn't absolve you of knowing the right from wrong. It just maybe saves keystrokes. Eventually, maybe even this year, if this moves fast enough, we might start to see a few tools that claim to use AI to make decisions on your behalf. And we've already had some of that stuff out there, cost-saving solutions that analyze your AWS bill, stuff like that. But anyway, that's what I'm excited about for 2023. There's lots of other things, Docker releasing a new version, maybe getting a new MacBook. I don't know. But I think really for me, it's seeing what AI does in the DevOps space and how it's going to change our lives. I think eventually, 5 years from now, we're all going to be just managing AIs. And it doesn't mean we're replaced. It's not going to replace us because Terraform didn't replace us. Docker didn't replace us. Kubernetes didn't replace us. What they did let us do was do way more with less people. So I can manage now as a modern DevOps engineer 10 or 100 times more than I could a decade ago. A decade ago, I was still SSHing into servers one by one. And even when I did fleet-like stuff, it required a lot of manual tools and writing of scripts and automating of things. We didn't have orchestrators for regular apps yet. That wasn't really a thing. Very specialized workloads, Zookeeper and other things had their own orchestrator, but they were very niche and they were very workload specific. But we didn't have large scale solutions other than maybe, like some of the auto scaling features on EC2. So that's what we were doing a decade ago. But now I've got GitHub Actions running a bunch of my work every time I do a pull request and a commit. And it deploys things, it tests things, it scans them for vulnerabilities, it deploys them to Kubernetes clusters just to see if it works. And it does all that. That's not AI. That's just evolution of our tooling. So if you think of adding AI to that, it's just going to be making more of the decisions. One of the conversations we had yesterday, again, in the high fivers that you can join here on YouTube or on my website, the high fivers group, we were discussing that one of my hopes is that what AI lends us to is removing the drudgery of and avoiding having to write scripts for the drudgery of our jobs. The what we now call in SRE and in DevOps toil, the things that I have to do over and over again. So picture this: you have an AI, you maybe have to just type it out, like the generative AIs today. We just write a sentence, and then we're basically asking a question. And when you're in VS Code with Copilot now, you can say, write me a Docker file for Node.js, and it'll write you that Docker file. But what if I had an AI on my system that was installed on my Mac, and I said, create me a new repo based on React, and then also create a new repo for a custom MySQL container Docker file. Please clone those both to my machine, but also put them in my GitHub account, name them based on this project name, set up my GitHub action templates, automatically create dev containers for my VS Code, and open VS Code in that repo for me. Like, I should be able to do that, and then the AI knows all the tools available in its tool bag. It has all the access to my stuff, and it goes and does all that. And it's kind of like Terraform up, but much more intelligent and much cross-tool, because now the AI knows all the commands of Docker. It knows all the commands of Kubernetes. It understands those commands, at least in a basic way. So it can start creating all that drudgery and get rid of all that. And then I can say, hey, AI, take the production environment, make a backup copy of it using Valero, and then restore that in a new cluster using the standard EKS template in this repo, right? Like, I should be able to say that, and it's just pinging, it's just using all the tools and putting all that together. That's maybe 5 years away, maybe 10. But I think that's where we're headed, is that we're going to be able to tell the computer, finally, whether we talk to it or type it, we're going to be able to describe the outcome. Today, I can describe the outcome of a file in VS Code, and I can get a pretty accurate result. And it can even show me the 5 different ways it's going to install my Kubernetes file. If you haven't checked out Copilot, just go check it out. I know it's not free for everyone, but go just see some of the demos and people playing with it for coding. It's interesting for coding, but I think it's very interesting in DevOps as well. And people aren't really, I think, thinking about it and experimenting with it as much as we hoped yet. But I think that's this year. That's my big thing for this year. So anyway, that's a great question. We talked about that, by the way, on this show in December when we had our best of 2022. We talked about what we're thinking about for the future for 2023, and I talked a lot about AI. So, all right, we're going to wrap this up. I've been talking nonstop for 2 hours. I'm losing my voice. So get your last-minute questions in, and I'll try to give you short answers. I will be back here again next week for the 200th episode, and it's going to be very exciting. I'm very excited about that. 200th episode, and we're going to maybe have some giveaways, maybe do some surprise stuff. So same time every Thursday, and WASM container runtimes is also exciting. That is exciting. I'm looking forward to that being much more stable. Mostly what we need right now is we need the WASI interface to allow us to do more things, so we can write apps that can access the hard drive and do stuff on the network and have all the things that we normally expect. And that'll be exciting. Honey, I've never actually figured out how to say this correctly. NCQ? What's up, man? Yeah, we were just talking about you actually a while ago. We were talking about Swarm. So, Alexander, what can you say about reducing container runtime resources by using Unikernels? I think, excuse me, so sorry again for the coughing. Still got my cold. Unikernels are still very, very specialized. I mean, I actually talked to someone, I can't remember their name, but I talked to someone at KubeCon that was very all in on Unikernels. But it requires a lot of expertise, and you have to really know what you're doing. And then the question is, where are you running these things, right? So I don't see a lot of traction on that, like in mainstream. I don't know a single person that's running them, if that means anything to you. It doesn't mean that no one's running them. It just means in my worldview, my friends, my colleagues, Docker captains, none of them are running Unikernels that I'm aware of. So, we've got so many different layers of abstraction now. We've got Firecracker, I think it is, and some of these other concepts of where we're running virtual machines inside a container runtime. And so the kernels, granted the kernel is bigger than a unikernel in Linux, but to me, it's a very niche specialized market. So I don't really get people asking me. Doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's not mainstream. Docker hired or bought a unikernel company, but the way that they use that unikernel knowledge today is in Docker Desktop for running the mini Linux kit VM and learning doing the networking stuff that makes networking transparent in Docker Desktop, makes it seem like it's a part of your host. And that's it, right? They didn't actually go in and reinvent unikernels for containers or anything like that. And of course, unikernels have to be workload specific, right? So I don't know enough to know what's next for that. And I just don't see anyone really doing it in mainstream. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe because those people aren't on the edge and they don't have very, very limited resources. They're not working at NASA, so they don't have to ship things into space. Because I don't know anyone at NASA, so I don't work with anyone at NASA. So anyway, all right. Well, I appreciate all of you for being here. I know we're wrapping it up. Sorry you're too late. And you're going to have to rewatch, but and this is a nonstop show of answering 2 hours of stuff. And if you just got here, let me just show you what you missed, and you can go back for it, because I'll just scroll through my tabs real quick for you. We talked about service mesh for a little bit, my opinions. Talked about Meshery. If you want to learn service mesh, go there to Meshery. I talked about the no hello, or don't ask to ask, just ask, which is how we operate our Discord server. Just ask your question, even if it's off topic. We'll let you know. It doesn't matter. We're not gonna be mean at you. We try to be nice. I have a new course starting in March. It's gonna be a live course. It's gonna be focused on GitHub Actions for CI automation, leading edge stuff. CI automation plus GitOps with Argo CD. So it's gonna be very highly. It's gonna be a very intense, very short 2 weeks, 90 minutes a day, every other day. And we're going to be doing it live together in small groups. And I mean small, like 10 to 30 small. So check that out if you want to. That's on my website. You can scroll up in the list. All these links are going to be there. I have a default pod spec that you can use for any of your Kubernetes. That's also on my GitHub, also earlier in the show. Let's see, what else do we have? What else do we do? We talked about the DevOps handbook. If you're learning DevOps now, it's absolutely the first thing you should do. You can listen to it on Audible. You can get it in digital format. You can get it in paperback. Go do that. I also recommend the DevOps Foundations course on LinkedIn. It's a great way on your first days in DevOps before you start learning tools. Also, I have my own opinions on DevOps that are available on GitHub in my AMA. Portworx is one of the last remaining working storage drivers for Swarm that I believe, if you need to run databases in Swarm, which I wouldn't recommend. If you need to run databases, I would just recommend Kubernetes, but I know some of you do. So if you want to run databases, Portworx is one of the remaining few projects until we get another major update of Swarm to support more advanced CSIs, essentially. So there's that. Teleport for getting into your Kubernetes clusters remotely or into any infrastructure. There's Teleport, there's Tailscale, which I didn't mention. That was the other one I kept forgetting about. Tailscale, that's a popular VPN that people are using now. These are modern VPNs that aren't your typical, they're sort of like everything's its own node in a sort of mesh. There's also Infra, which is a really easy and great way. We had them all in the show earlier this year. Infra for accessing and creating new users in your Kubernetes clusters and remote accessing your clusters from a simple command line. It was super awesome. I have courses. My coupons are on my website. I have courses on Docker, Kubernetes, Swarm, Node.js for Docker, and of course that new one for GitOps. And Portainer is a nice web GUI for Kubernetes. People were asking me about web GUIs. Portainer, Commodore is a nice web GUI troubleshooting tool for Kubernetes. They just got a bunch of new funding. There is a spreadsheet I have for all the Docker desktop alternatives. And you can find, if you can't run Docker Desktop, or if you're curious about other options like Lima, Podman, now Podman Desktop, all those things, they're there. Docker has a new release coming this year, we think. You can see in their open source on the Moby project that they're scheduling their new version formats of version 23, which will be for this year. Also, in case you're into podcasts, Twit is a great resource for dozens of technical podcasts, all super geeky. They've been around for 15 years and they're great. I love them. Twit.tv. Also, my friend James, who helped get me this, gifted me this Kubernetes Love t-shirt. He has his own Dive Into channel here on YouTube. He's a Docker captain, does great stuff there. We talked a little bit about Kelsey Hightower's mention of a project called Kube Forward, which is a simple way to gain access when you're developing in Kubernetes and you want to use a remote cluster and you don't want to have to type a bunch of port forward commands. It's a pretty great little project. Also, you can join us on Discord, which is right above me, 12,000 people in a DevOps chat. Lastly, I have a store. You can buy merch there, including cool t-shirts and mugs. Valentine's Day is coming up. Tell your spouse to buy you one of my DevOps t-shirts or a DevOps mug. And finally, my website's been redesigned. We have an all new newsletter that if you're not signed up for the newsletter, go there and sign up. It's free. You will now get one weekly. I'm bringing the newsletter back from the dead. So the new first of the new newsletter will go out later today and will be a summary of everything I'm working on, plus some of the news I think is relevant in the community. And on there, you can get coupons for my courses. You can get recent blog posts, of course, videos and stuff like that, and all the other stuff that I create. And I think that might be it. So thank you all so much for being here. My voice is about to leave me. I'm going to take a break, and I will see you next week here on YouTube Live for the 200th episode. Ciao, everybody.